Imagine closing your eyes and stepping back thousands of years into a time before ink touched parchment, before libraries held scrolls, before any form of writing even existed. In that world, everything that mattered, every story, every law, every prayer, every memory of who you were, had to live and breathe inside the human mind. There were no hard drives, no clouds, no notebooks to fall back on. If a society wanted its identity to survive, it had to master the art of remembrance. How did ancient civilizations preserve their most sacred stories and essential knowledge across dozens of generations without losing a single detail? How did they make sure their gods weren't forgotten, their heroes remained legendary, and their values were passed down intact? The answer lies in one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated technologies, the hacking of memory itself. Early mythmakers didn't just tell stories, they engineered them. They crafted narratives so memorable, so deeply embedded with rhythm, symbol, and emotion, that they became impossible to forget. These weren't casual tales told around a fire. They were carefully constructed systems designed to endure. Through poetic meter, sacred ritual, symbolic architecture, and communal retelling, these ancient creators built what we can think of as eternal legacy systems, cultural frameworks so resilient that they shaped civilizations for millennia and continue to echo in our modern world. We still feel their presence today, from the archetypes that shape our films to the narrative techniques used in education and marketing. This was cognitive engineering on a grand scale, and its genius lies in its simplicity and power. In this video, we're going to uncover exactly how they did it. We'll explore the secrets behind their methods, how rhythm and repetition turned words into music, how symbols compressed complex ideas into unforgettable images, and how rituals transformed stories into lived experiences. We'll journey from the epic poets of ancient Greece to the oral historians of West Africa, from the Vedic chanters of India to the ceremonial architects of Egypt. And perhaps most importantly, we'll discover why these ancient memory hacks remain deeply relevant in our digital age, where information is abundant but meaning can feel fleeting. This is more than a history lesson. It's an exploration of how humans have always sought to make their mark on eternity. Now, let's dive into the first technique, the art of oral tradition. Before a single word was ever written down, knowledge lived in the breath and the body. It traveled on the human voice, carried from one generation to the next in a fragile but astonishingly resilient chain of memory. This was the world of oral tradition, and to call it simple storytelling is to profoundly underestimate the genius of our ancestors. For them, this was a high-stakes technology of preservation. A society's entire identity, its history, its laws, its spiritual beliefs, its very survival manual depended on the flawless recall of a chosen few. These bards, griots, and shamans were far more than entertainers. They were the living libraries, the hard drives, and the cultural guardians of their people. They didn't just hope their stories would be remembered, they engineered them to be unforgettable. They employed a sophisticated toolkit of cognitive techniques designed to work in perfect harmony with how the human brain naturally encodes and retrieves information. Repetition was their first and most powerful tool. Crucial phrases, pivotal moments, and important character descriptions were woven back into the narrative again and again. Think of Homer's epics, where Odysseus is consistently the man of twists and turns, and Athena is repeatedly the gray-eyed goddess. These weren't poetic flourishes, they were mnemonic anchors. If a storyteller's mind momentarily wandered during an hours-long recitation, these recurring epithets acted like buoys, marking the channel and allowing them to find their place again without missing a beat. But the true magic, the element that transformed these spoken-word libraries into a self-correcting, distributed network, was the community itself. stories weren't told in isolation by a single author. They were performed in the center of the village, heard by an audience that often knew the tales as well as the teller. This created a collective memory system. If a bard accidentally altered a key detail, perhaps misnaming a hero or skipping a vital step in a creation myth, the crowd would know. They would react, they would correct, they would hold the teller accountable. This social reinforcement ensured a remarkable level of accuracy across centuries. It was a system of checks and balances built not on paper, but on participation. This method was so effective that it allowed entire cultures to weather unimaginable storms. The Celtic peoples, for instance, maintained a rich and complex mythological tradition entirely through oral means for generations, even as their lands were invaded and their political structures changed. Their stories of the Tuatha De Danann, of Cu Chulainn, and of the otherworld remained intact, preserving a unique world, long before it was ever written down by Christian monks. Similarly, the epic of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire, was meticulously preserved by griot families for centuries through oral performance alone, ensuring the legacy of a nation lived on in the spoken word. These oral systems were the absolute bedrock of legacy building, proving that the most enduring storage device ever created is the human mind, connected to other minds through the power of a well-told tale. Think about the last time a catchy song got stuck in your head. No matter how hard you tried, you couldn't shake that melody or those lyrics. They played on a loop, perfectly preserved in your memory without any conscious effort. Ancient mythmakers didn't just understand this phenomenon, they mastered it. They discovered that by imposing a strict musical structure onto their stories, they could transform fragile spoken words into unforgettable mental recordings. This was the genius of rhythm and meter, the second powerful layer in their memory hacking toolkit. They didn't just tell their stories, they composed them. In ancient Greece, epic poets like Homer used a specific rhythmic pattern called dactylic hexameter. This meter, with its distinctive long and short syllables arranged in a repeating 6-beat pattern, created a kind of sonic scaffolding for the narrative. It forced the storyteller into a predictable cadence where every line had the same musical feel. This rhythmic consistency did something remarkable. It turned the act of recitation into a kind of chant, making it far easier to remember thousands of lines of poetry verbatim. The rhythm itself became a guide, pulling the bard through the story almost automatically. If you've ever found yourself finishing the lyrics to a song without thinking, you've experienced a tiny glimpse of this ancient cognitive technology. But the most stunning example of this practice comes from ancient India with the Rigveda. This vast collection of Sanskrit hymns is one of the oldest known texts in any Indo-European language, but it wasn't written down for over 3,000 years. Its preservation was an oral project of breathtaking precision. Priests known as Brahmins memorized the entire text using a system of elaborate melodic recitation, with specific hand gestures and tonal variations for each syllable. The meter and melody were so strictly defined that even a single mispronunciation was considered a spiritual offense. This wasn't just about preserving poetry. It was about safeguarding what they believed to be the literal sound of creation, the vibrational patterns that structured the universe itself. They understood that the medium, the rhythm, the sound, the vibration was inseparable from the message. This approach to memory shows up in cultures across the globe. Old English epic poetry like Beowulf relied heavily on alliteration, the repetition of initial consonant sounds, to create its driving, memorable rhythm. West African griots often use the tension between a steady drumbeat and the fluidity of their spoken word, creating a call and response dynamic with the music that enhanced recall. These techniques all point to a universal human truth: our brains are wired for music and pattern. information set to a rhythm bypasses our normal critical filters and embeds itself directly into our long-term memory. Early mythmakers were essentially the world's first cognitive scientists, conducting millennia-long experiments on how to make information stick. They turned their most vital cultural knowledge into the earworms of the ancient world, ensuring their legacy would play on an endless loop for generations to come. And if rhythm was the melody that made myths unforgettable, repetition was the relentless, reassuring drumbeat beneath it. In a world without a written safety net, forgetting wasn't an option. A single missed detail could unravel a genealogy, distort a moral lesson, or dishonor a god. So, ancient mythmakers engineered redundancy directly into the very fabric of their stories. This wasn't a sign of a lack of creativity. It was a brilliant, calculated strategy for error-proofing memory. They built their narratives with built-in checkpoints and recovery systems, much like a modern computer program has error-correcting code. The most famous examples are the epithets we find in epic poetry. Odysseus is not just Odysseus, he is consistently the man of twists and turns, or the great tactician. Dawn is always rosy-fingered. These recurring phrases acted as cognitive landing points. For a bard reciting for hours, perhaps even days, mental fatigue was a real danger. In the middle of a complex battle description, the familiar rhythm of swift-footed Achilles would snap the mind back into place, realigning the narrative and preventing a cascade of errors. These epithets were more than descriptive, they were functional, mnemonic anchors that safeguarded the story's integrity. The Norse skalds took this concept of mental shorthand to a whole new level with a device called the kenning. A kenning is a poetic metaphor that replaces a simple noun with an evocative, often compound phrase. The sea wasn't just the sea, it was the whale road. A sword was a battle light, a ship was a wave steed. Now imagine the power of this from a memory perspective. A single, compact, and highly imaginative phrase could conjure an entire concept, complete with its connotations and imagery. To remember Whale Road was to instantly access the idea of the sea as a vast, traversable, and dangerous realm inhabited by great creatures. Kennings compressed complex ideas into dense, memorable packets of meaning, making the sagas not only easier to remember but also richer and more layered for the listener. This principle of redundancy extended beyond mere phrases. Entire scenes and formulaic story structures were repeated. In many cultural traditions, a hero might receive 3 challenges, visit 3 kingdoms, or be offered 3 choices. This numerical pattern creates a predictable framework that is easier for the mind to store and retrieve. The repetition of a specific type of scene, like the arming of a warrior before battle, describing each piece of armor and weapon in a set order, provided another familiar pathway for the storyteller to follow. These patterns transformed the immense, sprawling body of a culture's mythology into a series of well-trodden mental trails. Even if a teller momentarily lost their way, the structure itself would guide them back to the path, ensuring the myth emerged intact, retelling after retelling, generation after generation. This ingenious use of repetition built incredible resilience into the oral tradition, allowing these foundational stories to survive not just the failings of individual memory, but the rise and fall of empires themselves. While rhythm and repetition provided the structural framework for memory, it was the power of vivid, breathtaking imagery that truly brought these ancient stories to life inside the mind's eye. Our brains are not designed to remember lists of facts or abstract philosophies with perfect clarity. We are visual creatures wired to recall pictures, scenes, and emotional experiences with far greater fidelity. The early mythmakers understood this fundamental aspect of human cognition on an intuitive level. They didn't just describe events, they painted mental pictures so rich, so dramatic, and so saturated with sensory detail that they became impossible to shake. A listener didn't just hear about a hero's journey, they saw the gloomy forests, felt the chilling mist of the underworld, and trembled at the sight of a many-headed serpent coiling before them. This technique of visualization transformed passive listening into an active, immersive experience. Consider the immense, world-spanning tree Yggdrasil from Norse mythology. A storyteller wouldn't simply state that the universe is connected. They would describe the gargantuan ash tree, its roots drilling down into the wells of fate and wisdom, its branches stretching over the 9 realms, supporting the cosmos itself. An eagle perched at its peak, a dragon gnawed at its roots, and a squirrel ran messages of strife up and down the trunk. This isn't just a symbol, it's a full, animated, and incredibly detailed mental map. To remember the complex Norse cosmology, all a person had to do was recall the image of the tree and its bustling inhabitants. The abstract concept of cosmic interconnection was made instantly tangible, lodged in the memory as a vivid, navigable landscape. Perhaps one of the most sophisticated applications of this imagery as guide exists in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This was not a book for casual reading, but a collection of spells and instructions designed to guide a soul through the terrifying and complex landscape of the afterlife. Without a visual GPS, how could anyone remember the precise sequence of challenges? The text provides the solution through lavish, unforgettable imagery. It describes in meticulous detail the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth, the monstrous Ammit waiting to devour the unworthy, the various gates and their specific guardians who must be addressed by name. A priest or a family member reciting these texts would be effectively walking the soul through a pre-visualized, highly detailed itinerary. The listener, whether a living initiate or a spirit in transition, would use these descriptions to construct a mental walkthrough, turning an incomprehensible journey into a series of familiar, albeit terrifying, landmarks. This ensured that essential spiritual knowledge was not a set of rules to memorize, but a vivid path to walk, making the information both more memorable and more empowering. But beyond the vivid imagery that painted pictures in the mind, early mythmakers employed an even more sophisticated tool, the language of symbolism. They understood that the most complex and abstract truths about existence, morality, and the cosmos could not be easily conveyed through direct explanation. Instead, they compressed these vast philosophies into powerful, resonant symbols and metaphors. A single, well-chosen image could act as a cognitive key, unlocking layers of meaning that a listener could unpack and contemplate for a lifetime. This symbolic layering transformed myths from simple stories into dense repositories of wisdom, ensuring they remained relevant as societies evolved because each generation could find new meaning within the same ancient symbols. Consider the near-universal symbol of the serpent. Across countless cultures, from the Mesopotamian mus hachek letter 1e2, bus hachek s hachek u to the Norse Jörmungandr, and in the biblical Garden of Eden, the serpent rarely represents just a simple animal. It is a multifaceted symbol, often embodying chaos, temptation, hidden knowledge, rebirth, and the cyclical nature of life due to its ability to shed its skin. This one creature becomes a compact metaphor for a whole set of challenging and interconnected ideas about the dangers and necessities of change, the dual nature of wisdom, and the disruptive forces that are an inherent part of creation. A listener didn't need a philosophical treatise to grasp these concepts. The symbol of the serpent delivered them in a single, unforgettable package, ripe for personal interpretation and deep reflection. The Mesopotamian flood myth, a precursor to many other deluge stories, is a prime example of this symbolic compression at work. On its surface, it's a thrilling narrative of catastrophic weather and a heroic survivor, Utnapishtim. But its true power lies in its profound symbolic layers. It wasn't merely a story about divine punishment for a noisy humanity. It was a metaphor for the unpredictable and often violent nature of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, whose floods could bring both life-giving silt and utter destruction. The story symbolized the concept of renewal, the idea that from utter annihilation, a new, purified world could emerge. It spoke to divine judgment, the fragility of human civilization, and the hope for a fresh start. This rich tapestry of meaning allowed the myth to resonate with an agricultural society that lived at the mercy of nature's cycles, giving them a framework to understand their world. The symbol of the flood contained an entire worldview. This practice of encoding meaning extended to simpler, everyday objects within the stories. A simple cup or chalice was rarely just a drinking vessel. It could symbolize community, sacrifice, or divine grace. A journey across a desert wasn't merely a travelogue. It represented a spiritual trial, a period of purification and testing. By infusing these common elements with deeper significance, mythmakers ensured their stories operated on multiple levels simultaneously. A child might enjoy the exciting surface adventure, while an elder or an initiate would perceive the profound philosophical and spiritual commentary woven just beneath. This ensured the myth's longevity, as its value and relevance grew with the listener's own maturity and understanding. The story remained the same, but the meaning deepened over time, making these ancient narratives eternally new. Yet beyond the powerful symbols and vivid imagery, these myths demanded more than just a listener. They required a participant. The stories truly came alive not when they were spoken, but when they were physically enacted. This was the realm of ritual and performance, where myth transcended narrative and became a lived, embodied experience. Ancient cultures understood that to make a story truly unforgettable, you had to engage the entire body, the rhythm of the dance, the scent of incense or smoke, the taste of sacred food, the sound of unified chanting, the awe of witnessing a dramatic spectacle. This multisensory assault on the senses forged memories that were not merely intellectual but visceral, emotional, and deeply personal. Consider the great Greek dramas performed in the theaters of Athens. These were not simple plays for entertainment. They were religious ceremonies dedicated to Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and transformation. When an actor donned the mask of Oedipus or Antigone, they were not just portraying a character, they were temporarily channeling a mythical archetype. The audience didn't just watch a tragic story unfold. They collectively experienced catharsis, a purging of pity and fear, as they witnessed the horrors of fate on stage. The sweeping masks amplified the voices, the stylized movements created a sense of grandeur, and the chorus's rhythmic chanting provided a constant emotional and narrative guide. This immersive environment transformed the myth from a distant tale into a shared psychological event, searing its themes of hubris, fate, and justice into the hearts and minds of every citizen present. This principle of embodied myth was perhaps most profound in initiation rituals, like the famous Eleusinian mysteries. For nearly 2,000 years, individuals were initiated into this secret cult, which promised knowledge of the afterlife and a blessed existence beyond death. The central myth was the story of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, who was abducted into the underworld. But initiates didn't just hear this story, they physically reenacted it. They likely participated in a sacred procession from Athens to Eleusis, fasted in sympathy with Demeter's grief, and then, in the great hall of the Telesterion, were shown sacred objects and enacted dramas in a climactic, awe-inspiring ceremony that was forbidden to ever be spoken of aloud. The power of the experience came from the complete immersion, the exhaustion of the march, the hunger of the fast, the fear and anticipation of the unknown, and the final, overwhelming revelation. By physically walking in the footsteps of the goddesses, their emotional journey became the initiate's own, making the promise of life after death not an abstract belief, but a felt, undeniable certainty. The memory of that night, with all its sensory and emotional intensity, was the vehicle for the sacred knowledge itself. this tradition of turning myth into physical action is a universal human practice. In Native American cultures, complex cycles of stories are performed through elaborate dances where dancers embody animal spirits, ancestors, or celestial beings. The rhythm of the drums, the intricate regalia, and the precise symbolic movements all work together to tell a story and connect the community to the spiritual world. In ancient Vedic rituals, every gesture of the priest's hand, every offering thrown into the fire, and every syllable chanted was a precise reenactment of the cosmic order described in the myths. The ritual was the myth in action, a way of maintaining the balance of the universe through performance. This fusion of story and physical practice ensured that cultural values were not learned but incorporated, felt in the bones and remembered by the body long after the words had faded. It was the ultimate memory hack, making the individual a living part of the story itself. But beyond the emotional and physical immersion of ritual, ancient societies anchored identity in something even more personal: bloodline. In a world where kings and commoners alike derived their rights, their status, and their very place in the cosmos from their ancestry, genealogy was far more than a family tree. It was a living map of legitimacy and a powerful mnemonic chain that connected the mundane present directly to the legendary past. Mythmakers masterfully wove these lengthy lineages into the very fabric of their narratives, transforming what might seem to us like a dry list of names into a compelling and unforgettable system for preserving history. Think of the Icelandic sagas, epic tales of settlement and feud. They almost invariably begin not with action, but with a detailed account of a hero's ancestry, tracing their line back through generations, often to a Norse god or a legendary Scandinavian king. This wasn't mere boasting, it was a crucial establishing shot for the entire story. By declaring that a character was the son of and grandson of specific, often famous predecessors, the saga immediately framed their actions. A man's courage, his temper, or his destiny was understood as an inheritance, a trait passed down through this recited bloodline. To memorize your own genealogy, as many free Icelanders were expected to do, was to carry a personal passport through history, one that located you within the larger narrative of your culture and justified your claim to your land and your honor. This practice finds one of its most profound expressions in the genealogies of the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the book of Genesis. These lists, like the generations from Adam to Noah or from Shem to Abraham, serve a dual purpose. On one level, they create an unbroken chain of memory, a historical timeline that connects the covenant between God and Abraham all the way back to the very creation of humanity. This provided a powerful sense of continuity and divine purpose for the Israelite people. But on another, more subtle level, these genealogies are themselves mnemonic devices. The rhythms of the begat passages, the patterns in the names, and the occasional short story attached to a specific figure within the list all act as hooks for memory. They transform a potentially monotonous recitation into a structured, rhythmic chant, making the vast sweep of generations easier to store and recall accurately. The power of this system lay in its beautiful fusion of the personal and the collective. For an individual, knowing your lineage by heart was a point of pride and identity. But for the culture, the combined memory of thousands of individuals reciting their interconnected genealogies created a massive, distributed, and incredibly resilient historical database. It was a living archive stored not in a vulnerable clay tablet or a scroll, but in the minds of the people themselves. If one person forgot a name, another would remember. This collective safeguarding ensured that the legacy wasn't just about a list of names. It was about preserving the entire cultural history attached to those names, the migrations, the alliances, the great deeds, and the foundational laws that were passed down through those bloodlines. Your family history was, in a very real sense, the world's history. While the stories were carried in the mind and the bloodlines, the myths also needed a permanent home, a fixed point in the landscape where the abstract could become concrete. This is where the ancient memory hackers turned to their most enduring medium, stone itself. They understood that to truly etch a belief system into the collective consciousness, you had to build it. Sacred spaces and architecture became the ultimate expression of this principle. Massive, physical memory palaces designed not for one individual, but for an entire civilization. These structures were far more than just places of worship. They were three-dimensional maps of the cosmos, narrative pathways made of limestone and granite, and eternal stages for the perpetual reenactment of myth. Take the journey of an Egyptian priest through a temple complex like Karnak. He wasn't just walking through a series of rooms, he was retracing the very steps of creation. The design was a precise architectural metaphor. The entrance, often marked by towering pylons, represented the sacred mountains at the edge of the ordered world. As he moved from the bright, open courtyard, a space accessible to more people, into the increasingly darker, more restricted halls, he was symbolically traveling back in time to the primordial mound, the moment of first dawn. The ceiling, painted with stars and constellations, was the heavens, the floor was the earth. Every column, carved to resemble lotus plants or papyrus bundles, evoked the swampy, fertile chaos of none from which life first emerged. The ritual journey through this space was a physical recitation of the creation myth, a walkable story that engaged all the senses. The smell of incense, the coolness of the stone, the dimming light, and the final arrival at the dark, secluded sanctuary housing the god statue. This multisensory experience made the myth an undeniable, tangible reality. The temple's layout ensured that every ritual movement reinforced the cosmic order, literally grounding the story in a place you could touch. This concept of architecture as a cosmic model extends far beyond Egypt. Consider the mysterious stone circles of northern Europe, like Stonehenge. While their exact purpose remains debated, their alignment with celestial events is undeniable. The arrangement of the massive trilithons and the heel stone creates a precise astronomical observatory, marking the solstices and equinoxes. For the people who built it, this wasn't just about tracking seasons. It was about physically manifesting the relationship between the earth and the heavens. On the summer solstice, when the sun rose perfectly framed within the stones, the myth of a powerful sun god triumphing over darkness was performed by the cosmos itself, with the architecture as the crucial stage. The circle became a frozen calendar, a permanent guarantee that the cycles of their stories would continue year after year, century after century. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs built their pyramid temples as literal representations of their sacred geography. The pyramid was a man-made mountain, echoing the belief that gods resided in high places and that mountains were the source of life-giving water and the portals to other worlds. Climbing the steep steps to the summit at Tenochtitlan was a reenactment of a spiritual ascent, a journey toward the divine. The temple at the top was not just a shrine but the Axis Mundi, the center of the world, connecting the underworld, the earthly realm, and the heavens. The entire city lay out often mirrored constellations on the ground, turning the urban landscape into a reflection of the celestial one. By building their world to mirror their myths, these cultures created an inescapable learning environment. You couldn't walk through your city without unconsciously absorbing the sacred order of the universe. The architecture itself was the teacher, and every citizen was a student, living inside a story made of stone. Now let's turn our ears to the ancient world, where the very air seemed to vibrate with meaning. Beyond the rhythm of spoken poetry lay an even more powerful tool, melody itself. While rhythm provides a scaffold, music and chant weave an emotional and cognitive spell that plain speech could never match. Early cultures discovered that by setting their most vital stories to song, they could bypass the critical, forgetful mind and etch information directly into the soul. This was the art of auditory encoding, transforming lengthy narratives and complex navigation charts into sonic journeys that were not only easier to remember, but also imbued with a sacred, emotional power that made them feel essential to survival itself. Consider the profound, echoing halls of a medieval monastery where Gregorian chant flourished. These weren't simply religious songs, they were meticulously designed mnemonic systems. The monophonic, unaccompanied melodies, with their free-flowing rhythm and Latin texts, served a dual purpose. Therapeutically, the sustained tones were believed to induce a state of contemplative peace, opening the mind to receive divine wisdom. Practically, the rising and falling melodic contours acted as auditory highlighting, emphasizing key words and phrases from biblical psalms and scriptures. A specific melodic phrase might always accompany a particular concept, tethering the sound to the meaning. For monks who took vows of silence, these chants became their primary language of worship and study, a vast library of theological and philosophical knowledge stored not in books, but in sequences of notes that they would sing daily. The melody became the key that unlocked the memory of the text. This practice finds its most ancient and rigorous expression in the Vedas of India. The preservation of these texts orally for over 3 millennia is perhaps the most stunning achievement in the history of human memory. It was accomplished through an incredibly elaborate system of chanting known as pathas that functioned like a sophisticated error correction code for the human voice. Priests didn't just memorize the words, they mastered multiple precise ways of reciting them. There was the simple continuous recitation, but also more complex forms like the Kramapatha, where words were paired, word 1 with word 2, word 2 with word 3, and so on, and the even more complex Jotapatha, where words were recited in a repeating, woven pattern, word 1, word 2, word 1, word 2, word 3, word 2, word 3. This meant that even if a single word was misremembered in one method, its correct placement would be confirmed by its role in the others. The melody and the intricate recitation techniques were inseparable from the meaning. They guaranteed that not a single syllable, not a single accent was ever lost to time. The sound itself was considered divine, a vibrational reality that had power over the cosmos. Perhaps the most breathtaking application of this sonic technology is the Aboriginal Australian concept of songline. A songline is far more than a melody. It is a sung map of the entire continent, an oral atlas encoded in a series of ancient songs. As a person journeys across the vast, featureless outback, they sing the song cycle associated with that specific route. Each verse in the song corresponds to a specific landmark, a rock formation, a waterhole, a particular stand of trees. The rhythm and the pitch of the notes describe the topography itself. The melody might rise and fall with the land, describing the ascent of a hill or the winding path of a dry riverbed. The lyrics often tell the story of the creator ancestors who formed that landscape during the dreamtime, meaning the navigator is literally walking through and singing the story of creation with every step. This system allowed people to travel thousands of miles across unfamiliar territory, guided solely by the memory of a song. The myth, the map, and the melody were one and the same, a perfect fusion of story, survival, and sacred memory that turned the entire continent into a navigable, sung text. Yet even with the powerful anchors of rhythm, repetition, and melody, the sheer scale of these ancient epics presented a formidable challenge. How could a storyteller possibly hold the entire sprawling narrative of a hero's life in their head, from beginning to end, without losing the thread? The answer lies in a brilliant form of organizational hacking, the use of universal storytelling structures. Our minds are pattern recognition machines. We naturally seek out and remember familiar sequences. Early mythmakers intuitively understood this, crafting their most complex tales not as chaotic streams of events, but as journeys that followed a deeply ingrained, predictable roadmap. The most famous of these is the template we now call the hero's journey, a narrative architecture so effective that it remains the backbone of our most beloved stories today, from Star Wars to The Lord of the Rings. This structure provided a pre-built mental framework for both the teller and the listener. A bard embarking on the Odyssey didn't have to invent a new plot from scratch. He was walking a well-trodden path. The story would begin with a call to adventure as Odysseus is summoned to the Trojan War. We then see his refusal of the call as he attempts to stay home with his family, followed by the meeting with a mentor and the crossing of the threshold into the unknown world of monsters and gods. This initial stage of departure established a familiar starting point that the audience would immediately recognize and accept. For the storyteller, it meant the first part of the epic was already neatly categorized in their memory, a series of expected beats to hit before moving on to the next major segment. The true test, of course, comes in the middle, the initiation. This is where the hero faces a road of trials, encounters allies and enemies, and approaches the innermost cave for a central ordeal. In the Odyssey, this encompasses the vast majority of the story: the encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the seductive allure of Circe, the journey to the underworld, and the deadly passage between Scylla and Charybdis. For a listener, this structure creates a satisfying rhythm of challenge and temporary resolution. For the bard, it functions as a modular system. Each trial is a self-contained episode, a narrative module that can be slotted into the overarching journey. If the pressure of performance was intense, the teller could focus on remembering the details of the Cyclops episode, secure in the knowledge that its place in the larger sequence was already defined by the structure itself. The hero's journey provided the mental file folders. The individual adventures were the documents placed inside. We see this same masterful use of a predictable arc in the even older epic of Gilgamesh. The wild, arrogant King Gilgamesh begins his journey with the departure, forming a friendship with the wild man Enkidu. His initiation is his series of triumphs and subsequent tragedies, most notably his profound grief over Enkidu's death, which forces him to confront his own mortality. This leads him to his ultimate ordeal, the quest for immortality itself. The final stage, the return, sees him coming back to Uruk empty-handed in his pursuit of eternal life, yet profoundly transformed. He returns with something far more valuable for his people, the wisdom that true legacy is found not in endless life, but in the enduring works of civilization, the great walls of his city that will outlast him. This clear, three-act structure, arrogant king, transformative quest, return with wisdom, turned a potentially rambling biography into a focused and unforgettable moral and philosophical journey. The predictable pattern ensured the core message of the myth was never lost, no matter how many generations passed it down. It was a foolproof system for preserving not just a story, but its deepest meaning. But these epic structures did more than just organize adventures. They served as the primary delivery system for a culture's most cherished principles. A thrilling tale of a hero battling a monster is far more effective at teaching courage than a simple lecture on the subject. This was the genius of embedding cultural values directly into the narrative DNA of myths. The stories became stealthy, engaging vehicles for moral instruction, wrapping essential lessons about how to live and how to behave within the irresistible packaging of drama, adventure, and wonder. A listener captivated by the fate of a character would unconsciously absorb the underlying values that character represented, internalizing a moral code that felt less like a rule and more like a fundamental truth. Consider the timeless appeal of Aesop's fables, those deceptively simple stories that have endured for over 2,000 years. A story like The Tortoise and the Hare isn't really about animals racing. It's a masterclass in encoding the value of perseverance and warning against the dangers of hubris. By using animal characters, the tale removes any pre-existing social baggage. The lesson isn't about a specific type of person, but a universal trait. The slow, determined tortoise and the boastful, overconfident hare are pure archetypes, making the moral instantly clear and universally applicable. Similarly, the boy who cried wolf brilliantly packages the importance of honesty and the consequences of eroding trust into a compact, unforgettable narrative package. These stories were designed to be told and retold, ensuring that each new generation learned these core societal values not through scolding, but through the powerful emotional resonance of a well-told story. This value coding operated on a much grander scale within national epics. The Iliad, for instance, is far more than a war story. It is a deep, complex exploration of values in conflict. The epic pits the value of personal honor, embodied by Achilles and his rage over a slight to his honor, against the value of communal responsibility and duty, represented by Hector, who fights and dies for the protection of his city and family. An ancient Greek listener wouldn't just hear about a great battle. They would be immersed in a moral dilemma that reflected the very tensions within their own society. What matters more, the individual's glory or the good of the group? The story doesn't provide an easy answer, but it forces the audience to grapple with the question, making the values themselves dynamic and deeply considered rather than just a list of commandments. These narratives became the bedrock of cultural identity. To be Greek was to understand the lessons of the Iliad and the Odyssey. To be Norse was to know the values of courage in the face of inevitable fate, as championed in the sagas. The stories provided a shared moral language and a common set of behavioral expectations. They taught young men and women what was expected of them: how to be a loyal friend, a brave warrior, a wise leader, or a hospitable host. This process ensured that a culture's core ethos could survive migrations, invasions, and immense social changes. The stories could be adapted and retold, but the central values embedded within them, like a genetic code, would continue to shape the identity and behavior of the people, generation after generation. The legacy was no longer just a record of events, it was a blueprint for living. Beyond the grand architectures of rhythm and the deep emotional currents of ritual, ancient storytellers also mastered a kind of cognitive sleight of hand. They developed a clever and highly effective toolkit of specific mnemonic devices, mental shortcuts and patterns that acted like hooks for the memory, ensuring that even the most complex information could be grasped and retained with ease. In a purely oral culture, these techniques weren't just helpful. They were as essential and precise as a modern-day password or a secure encryption key, safeguarding the integrity of their most vital knowledge. One of the most common and powerful of these tools was the use of numerical patterns. Our brains have a natural affinity for grouping information into manageable chunks, and mythmakers exploited this tendency to its fullest. The prevalence of the number 3 is a perfect example. We see it everywhere, the 3 fates who spin, measure, and cut the thread of life in Greek mythology. The 3 attempts a hero is often given to complete a task, the 3 magical objects a character must retrieve. This pattern creates a satisfying sense of progression, a beginning, a middle, and an end that is inherently easy to follow and remember. Expanding on this, the 12 labors of Heracles provide a more extensive but equally structured framework. The number 12 is large enough to encompass a vast epic of challenges, yet it remains a finite, countable list. A storyteller could mentally check off each labor as they narrated it, ensuring none were missed and the entire saga was recounted in its proper order. This numerical scaffolding provided a fail-safe outline for even the longest and most complicated narratives, but the ingenuity didn't stop with numbers. Poetic and linguistic devices were also sharpened into powerful mnemonic tools. Alliteration, the repetition of initial consonant sounds, created a catchy, almost musical quality that made phrases stick in the mind. Think of the relentless rolling R's in descriptions of a raging, roaring river, or the sharp S's in a slithering, sinister serpent. This technique added a layer of sonic texture that enhanced recall. Even more sophisticated were acrostics, where the first letter of each line or verse spells out a word or a message. While more common in later written traditions, the principle of initial letter cueing is a profoundly effective memory aid that likely had echoes in oral composition, helping a bard remember the sequence of a particularly intricate passage. Perhaps the most striking proof of this cognitive toolkitting's effectiveness comes from the realm of mathematics. Long before it was formalized in ink and parchment, the essence of the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right-angled triangle, was preserved and transmitted orally. It was encoded within poetic verses, its mathematical truth wrapped in the rhythmic and metaphorical language of sacred knowledge. This poetic formulation made an abstract geometric principle accessible, memorable, and transmissible across generations without the need for formal mathematical notation. It demonstrates that these mnemonic devices were not merely for stories and myths. They were the fundamental operating system for preserving all forms of complex information, from ethical codes to scientific understanding, turning the human mind into a living, breathing library of civilization's greatest discoveries. Yet for all their clever encoding and structural genius, these myths would have been fragile artifacts if they'd been locked in a single, unchanging form. The true secret to their immortality wasn't rigidity, but a breathtaking capacity for change. Myths were not static monuments, they were living, breathing organisms that evolved. Early storytellers understood that for a legacy to truly endure across centuries, it had to remain relevant. It had to speak to the present moment, even while carrying the voice of the past. This was perhaps their most sophisticated hack of all, the art of strategic adaptation. They mastered the delicate balance of updating the surface details, the settings, the character names, the specific challenges to reflect new realities, all while preserving the timeless, essential core of the story. This evolutionary flexibility allowed mythic traditions to survive the most brutal tests of time: conquest, mass migration, religious transformation, and the slow, steady drift of cultural values. We can see this brilliant adaptability in one of the most universal and persistent archetypes, the trickster. This figure appears in the mythology of virtually every culture on Earth, but they are never quite the same. In West African and African American traditions, he is Anansi the spider, a cunning figure who uses his wits to overcome larger, stronger opponents, often shaping the world itself through his clever deceptions. For the Norse, the trickster is Loki, a shape-shifting agent of chaos whose schemes both aid and endanger the gods, embodying the unpredictable and often dangerous nature of change. For many Native American cultures of the plains, the trickster is Coyote, a contradictory figure who is at once a creator, a fool, a culture hero, and a voracious glutton. The core essence of the trickster, disrupting order, challenging authority, and representing the unpredictable and creative force of chaos, remains constant. But the specific form he takes is perfectly tailored to the local environment and social structure. Anansi's stories often revolve around the value of intelligence over brute strength, a deeply resonant theme for peoples who faced oppression. Loki's tales explore the complex and often fraught relationship between order and chaos, a central tension in the worldview of seafaring warriors. The mythic software was the same, but the interface was expertly skinned for its local audience. This process of cultural translation becomes even clearer when we look at how entire mythic systems were adopted and adapted by conquering cultures. The Romans are a classic example. When they expanded into Greece, they didn't simply erase the rich Greek pantheon. they performed a brilliant act of mythological syncretism. They recognized the underlying patterns in the stories and mapped their own gods onto the existing Greek framework. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars, and Aphrodite became Venus. The core myths, the stories of power, love, jealousy, and war remained largely intact, but they were now wearing Roman clothes and serving a Roman purpose, legitimizing the new Roman state by connecting it to a prestigious and ancient cultural lineage. This wasn't theft, it was savvy evolutionary strategy. By absorbing and adapting rather than destroying, the Romans ensured the myth's survival while simultaneously consolidating their own power and cultural identity. The legacy was not lost, it was upgraded for a new operating system. This adaptive process ensured that myths were never brittle. They could bend without breaking. A story about a local river spirit could evolve into a tale about a sea god as a people migrated toward a coast. A myth explaining the harvest could be refined with new agricultural knowledge. The heroes of old could be recast to embody the evolving values of a new generation. This constant, subtle renovation kept the stories feeling immediate and vital. They were never allowed to become dusty relics because each generation of storytellers had the permission, and indeed the responsibility, to make them their own. This is why these ancient narratives still resonate with us today. They are not frozen in amber, they are a river constantly flowing and changing, yet always recognizably itself. They were designed not just to be remembered, but to live. This idea of a shared narrative responsibility transforms memory from a solitary burden into a communal bond, a social technology that distributed the weight of history across an entire network of minds. It wasn't just a single storyteller holding the entire cultural archive. It was the entire village, the entire tribe, acting as a living, breathing, self-correcting database. Every retelling was a public act performed in the center of the community, witnessed by an audience that often knew the stories as well as the teller. This created a powerful system of checks and balances. If a bard, perhaps fatigued from a long performance, accidentally skipped a crucial detail, altered a hero's name, or misstated a pivotal event, the collective memory of the audience would act as a safeguard. They would react, they would murmur a correction, they would hold the storyteller to the sacred standard of accuracy. This social reinforcement was the ultimate error correction code, ensuring that the core narrative remained remarkably consistent across generations, not written in stone, but woven into the very fabric of social interaction. We find one of the most formalized and respected examples of this in the West African griot tradition. A griot is far more than a storyteller. They are a historian, a genealogist, a musician, a cultural advisor, and a living archive. This role is often hereditary, passed down through specific families who dedicate their lives to the preservation of their people's history. For the Man peoples, the griot, or jelly, is the guardian of the epic of Sundiata Keita, the 13th century founder of the Mali Empire. This vast historical narrative, which details Sundiata's life, his exile, and his triumphant return to establish an empire, was preserved orally by griot families for centuries before it was ever written down. Their method was meticulous. They didn't just memorize a story, they internalized a sacred trust. Their training involved not only learning the precise words and the accompanying music of the kora harp lute, but also understanding the deep historical context and the nuanced meanings behind every event and character. The griot was the human hard drive upon which the legitimacy of rulers, the history of great families, and the very identity of a nation were stored. This made them indispensable figures in the court and the community, turning memory into a specialized, honored, and shared profession. This model of distributed memory is a universal human phenomenon. In ancient Ireland, the Fili were a highly trained class of poets who underwent decades of rigorous training to memorize the vast history, genealogy, and lore of their people. Their recall was so trusted that their testimony in legal disputes was considered incontrovertible. Among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the knowledge of songlines and creation stories isn't held by one person, but is distributed across clans and moieties, with each group responsible for a specific part of the narrative. Only when all the pieces are brought together does the full story emerge, making the community itself the complete library. This social hacking ensured that cultural legacy was not a fragile thread dependent on one individual's life, but a robust, resilient web. If one person fell silent, others remained to carry the song. The story could endure famine, war, and migration because it was never stored in just one place. It lived in the space between people, in the collective act of remembering together, transforming every member of the community into a custodian of their own enduring legacy. But beyond the intellectual frameworks and the social networks of memory, the ancient mythmakers targeted the very heart of what makes us human, our capacity to feel. They understood on a profound level that information wrapped in emotion is information that becomes unforgettable. A dry list of historical events might fade, but the story of a heartbreaking loss or a triumphant against all odds victory, that sticks with you for a lifetime. This was emotional engineering, a deliberate effort to weave powerful feelings directly into the narrative to ensure the story, and all the wisdom it contained, would permanently fuse itself to the listener's soul. They crafted their tales not just to be heard but to be felt. Consider the devastating Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. On its surface, it's a simple story of a journey to the underworld. But its true power lies in its masterful manipulation of emotion. Orpheus, the greatest musician who ever lived, loses his beloved wife Eurydice to a snake bite on their wedding day. His grief is so profound that his mournful music moves the gods themselves to pity, granting him a chance to retrieve her from the land of the dead. The condition is simple: he must lead her out without looking back until they both reach the sunlight. The listener is then taken on an agonizing emotional journey. We feel the soaring hope as he charms the guardians of the underworld. We share his anxious tension as he walks that terrible path, listening for her footsteps behind him. And then, in a moment of devastating human weakness, just as he glimpses the sun, doubt overwhelms him. He turns, he sees her, only for a fleeting second before she is torn from him forever, this time for eternity. The story doesn't just tell us about loss, it makes us experience the crushing weight of it, the tragic intersection of hope and human fallibility. That emotional punch, that visceral feeling of grief and regret, is what makes the myth indelible. You don't just remember the plot, you remember how it made you feel, and in doing so, you remember its lesson about trust, patience, and the finality of death. This emotional hacking wasn't limited to tragedies, of course. The sheer, awe-inspiring spectacle of a creation myth was designed to evoke a sense of wonder that would anchor the story in a listener's mind. Imagine hearing the Norse account of the world's formation for the first time. The great void of Ginnungagap, the fiery realm of Muspelheim meeting the icy wastes of Niflheim. The primordial giant Ymir formed from the dripping Thor, and the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve fashioning the world from his very body. The sky is his skull, the earth his flesh, the seas his blood, and the mountains his bones. This is a story of cosmic, breathtaking scale and raw, visceral power. It inspires awe and a humbling sense of one's place in a vast, magnificent universe. That feeling of awe is a cognitive glue. The story becomes associated with that sense of wonder, making it far more memorable than a simple, straightforward explanation ever could be. Similarly, the triumphant ending of a hero's journey is engineered to deliver a powerful dose of cathartic joy and relief. After following Odysseus through 20 years of torment, struggle, and heartache, the moment he is finally recognized by his faithful son Telemachus and then his loyal wife Penelope is emotionally overwhelming. The audience, having invested emotionally in his long suffering, shares in that hard-won victory. This positive emotional payoff reinforces the story's values, the importance of perseverance, loyalty, and cunning intelligence. It feels good to remember it because it felt so good to experience its conclusion. By strategically employing the entire spectrum of human emotion, from gut-wrenching fear and sorrow to heart-pounding excitement and uplifting joy, the Mythmakers ensured their narratives did more than just inform. They resonated, they became part of the emotional landscape of the culture, remembered not just by the mind but by the heart. This profound fusion of myth and ritual represents the ultimate step in the ancient art of memory hacking, where a story ceased to be a narrative and became a lived reality. It was one thing to hear a powerful tale told around a fire, to feel its emotional pull and remember its symbolic lessons. It was something else entirely to physically participate in that story, to become an actor in the cosmic drama itself. This is where the line between belief and experience completely blurred. Rituals transformed passive listeners into active participants, using the entire human sensorium, sight, sound, smell, touch, and movement to engrave the myth not just upon the mind, but upon the very body and soul of the individual. The myth was no longer a memory to be recalled. It was a reality to be inhabited, an experience so visceral it rewired one's understanding of the world. The Aztec ceremony you mentioned is perhaps the most extreme and potent example of this principle. For the Aztecs, the central creation myth was the story of the god Nanahuatzin, who courageously leapt into a great fire to become the sun and set the cosmos in motion. However, this divine sacrifice was not a one-time event. The Aztecs believed the sun required constant nourishment, a daily dose of sacred energy known as Chalchiuhatl, or precious water, human blood, to continue its journey across the sky and stave off a permanent, apocalyptic darkness. Therefore, a ritual human sacrifice was not merely a symbolic act. It was a direct, literal reenactment of the original creation myth. The priest, representing the gods, and the sacrificial victim, embodying Nanahuatzin, collaborated in a terrifying performance that sustained the universe. The beating heart held aloft to the sun was not a metaphor, it was the literal fuel that powered the cosmic engine. For everyone witnessing this ceremony, the myth was happening right before their eyes in the present tense. The story was made unbearably, unforgettable real, ensuring that every citizen understood their role in a fragile cosmos that depended on their collective ritual actions for its very survival. This concept of ritual as reality was by no means unique to the Aztecs. We see a different yet equally powerful version in the ancient Egyptian Heb-Sed festival, or Jubilee. This was a ritual performed by the pharaoh, typically after 30 years of rule, to magically renew his strength and vitality, and by extension, the fertility and stability of the entire kingdom. The ceremony involved the pharaoh physically reenacting the mythical triumphs of the gods. He would run a ritual course, fire arrows to the 4 cardinal directions, and be crowned again as king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Through these precise, symbolic actions, the pharaoh wasn't just commemorating a story. He was temporarily becoming the god Horus, re-founding the kingdom, and defeating the forces of chaos and decay anew. The ritual was a metaphysical reset button for the entire nation, a lived experience that reinforced the divine order of the universe and the pharaoh's central role within it. For the participants and observers, it was a powerful, annual reminder that their civilization was not a static entity but a dynamic, living myth that required active participation to maintain. This experiential hacking created the deepest possible form of cultural imprinting. It moved knowledge from the intellectual realm into the realm of muscle memory and instinct. You didn't need to intellectually believe the myth was true. You had felt its truth in the pounding of the drums, the collective gasp of the crowd, the smell of incense and smoke, and the awe of the spectacle. This is why these ritual reenactments were so effective at creating cohesive, resilient societies. They generated what sociologists call collective effervescence, a powerful sense of unity and shared purpose that emerges from group rituals. This shared emotional high bonded the community together, making the central tenets of their belief system feel self-evident and beyond question. The myth, performed again and again, became the unshakable foundation of reality itself, a foundation that could withstand foreign influence, internal strife, and the passage of time because it was etched into the very nervous system of every participant. While mythmakers skillfully crafted stories to target the memory through rhythm and emotion, they were also tapping into something far deeper and more fundamental within the human psyche. They were speaking a universal language, one composed of characters and patterns that feel instantly recognizable to us, no matter where or when we are born. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung proposed that beneath our personal consciousness lies a vast, shared reservoir of inherited experiences and symbolic patterns, what he termed the collective unconscious. Within this reservoir reside archetypes, universal blueprints for characters and situations that appear again and again in the myths, dreams, and stories of every culture. The Great Mother, the wise old man, the hero, the trickster, these are not inventions but discoveries, primal forms that early storytellers intuitively understood and wove into their narratives. This use of archetypes was a masterstroke of psychological hacking. By building their stories around these deeply ingrained patterns, mythmakers ensured their tales would feel instinctively familiar and profoundly resonant to any listener. A story featuring a hero who answers a call to adventure, faces great trials, and returns transformed doesn't need a lengthy introduction. We already understand the template on a gut level. It feels right, it feels true. This inherent familiarity acted as a powerful cognitive shortcut, dramatically easing the burden of memory. A bard introducing a new character as a trickster figure immediately conjured a set of expected behaviors and narrative functions, cleverness, rule-breaking, chaotic energy that the audience could instantly grasp without need for lengthy explanation. The archetype provided a ready-made mental file folder, allowing both the storyteller and the listener to quickly categorize, process, and remember the narrative. This is why these ancient stories possess such a timeless quality. The specific details might change. The hero might wield a sword or a laser blaster. The Great Mother might be an earth goddess or a galactic queen, but the underlying archetypal structure remains constant. We see the hero's journey as clearly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, seeking immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, as we do in Luke Skywalker's quest to become a Jedi and confront his father. We recognize the trickster's chaotic influence in both the Norse god Loki's schemes and in the clever, subversive antics of Bugs Bunny. This is not a case of plagiarism or lack of creativity. It is evidence that the most effective stories are those that speak directly to these universal, hardwired patterns within us. They connect the individual listener to a shared heritage of human experience, creating a powerful sense that this story, while new, is also ancient and eternal. This archetypal framework did more than just make stories easier to remember, it made them more meaningful. When we encounter an archetype, we are not just hearing a story about someone else, we are encountering a part of ourselves. The hero's journey mirrors our own struggles for growth and identity. The nurturing mother archetype connects to our universal need for comfort and security. The wise old man represents our search for guidance and knowledge. By engaging with these archetypal narratives, individuals were able to work through their own personal challenges and aspirations within a safe, symbolic container. The myth became a mirror for the soul, a tool for psychological development and cultural cohesion that ensured its lessons were not just memorized but deeply internalized, generation after generation. Yet for all the power of universal archetypes and shared stories, some of the most profound knowledge was never meant for the public square. It was carefully guarded, hidden behind layers of ritual and revelation, accessible only to those who proved themselves worthy. This practice of secrecy and initiation wasn't about elitism for its own sake. It was a brilliant psychological strategy. By restricting access to certain truths, ancient mystery schools created an aura of immense value and gravity around their teachings. The very act of earning this knowledge through a challenging, often terrifying, initiation process made it infinitely more memorable and sacred than any information freely given. This was exclusivity hacking, a method that transformed abstract philosophy into a deeply personal, life-altering possession. The most famous examples of this are the mystery schools of ancient Greece, particularly the Eleusinian mysteries dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. For nearly 2,000 years, individuals from all walks of life, from slaves to emperors like Marcus Aurelius, sought initiation. The central myth, the story of Persephone's abduction into the underworld and her mother's desperate search, was publicly known. But the mysteries, the secret rituals, the sacred objects shown, and the ultimate revelations about the afterlife were forbidden to be spoken of on pain of death. This vow of silence created an irresistible allure. The initiation itself was a grueling, multi-day process involving a sacred pilgrimage from Athens to Eleusis, fasting, and the drinking of a special barley-based potion called the kykeon. Finally, in the dark, cavernous hall of the telesterion, initiates would experience the epopteia, the final, awe-inspiring vision. The combination of physical ordeal, emotional anticipation, and the powerful climax of the ritual seared the experience into their very beings. The secret knowledge wasn't just heard, it was felt and seen, making it impossible to forget and too precious to ever divulge. This principle of graded revelation, unlocking wisdom in stages, was a masterclass in cognitive engagement. It recognized that true understanding is a process, not an event. In many esoteric traditions, from Pythagorean schools to certain Gnostic sects, teachings were structured hierarchically. A new initiate might start with basic ethical precepts and symbolic stories. Only after years of study and demonstration of their character and dedication would they be entrusted with deeper, more complex theological or philosophical concepts. This system did two things brilliantly. First, it ensured the student was fully prepared to understand and not misuse the knowledge. Second, it built a powerful narrative arc around learning itself. Each new level of initiation was a milestone, a personal triumph that reinforced the value of the wisdom acquired. The knowledge became part of the initiate's identity, a hard-won prize that was woven into the story of their own life. This made the information not just memorable but personally defining. The effectiveness of this method lies in a fundamental aspect of human psychology. We value what we work for far more than what we are given for free. A truth that is easily accessed can be easily dismissed, but a truth that requires sacrifice, perseverance, and personal transformation to obtain carries the weight of that entire journey. The mystery schools understood that the process of learning was as important as the information itself in forging an unforgettable legacy. By wrapping their core teachings in layers of ritual and secrecy, they didn't just protect the information from the unworthy, they optimized it for perfect, lifelong retention in the minds of the worthy. The secret was safe because it was no longer just a piece of data. It was the key to a new understanding of the self and the cosmos, an understanding that was earned, not merely taught. But the genius of these ancient legacy systems extended far beyond the realms of philosophy and psychology. they were also meticulously engineered to encode the most vital, practical information needed for daily survival. In a world without textbooks, GPS, or weather apps, myths became the ultimate user manuals for living, seamlessly weaving essential knowledge about navigation, agriculture, and ecology into the very fabric of captivating stories. This was utilitarian hacking at its most elegant, ensuring that a community's collective survival skills were not stored in a vulnerable library but sung around a campfire, danced in a ceremony, and passed down as an inseparable part of their cultural identity. We find perhaps the most breathtaking example of this in the Aboriginal Australian concept of songlines. As we touched on earlier, these are far more than melodies. They are acoustic maps of the entire continent, but their function goes even deeper. Each song in a songline cycle does not only describe a landmark, it contains vital, practical information about that place. The lyrics might detail the location of a hidden waterhole that only appears after a rare rain, or identify specific plants that are edible, medicinal, or poisonous. They might describe the behavioral patterns of animals, indicating the best times and places to hunt. The rhythm and cadence of the song could even convey the difficulty of the terrain ahead, whether the path is rocky, sandy, or smooth. A person singing the songline was not just navigating, they were accessing a dense, multi-layered database of survival knowledge that had been refined over tens of thousands of years. The story of the creator ancestors walking the land was the framework that made this immense catalog of environmental data coherent, memorable, and transmissible. To lose the song was to literally become lost and perish. To remember it was to carry a lifeline. This principle of embedding agricultural wisdom within narrative is beautifully illustrated by the Greek myth of Persephone. On its surface, it is a poignant story about a mother's grief and a daughter's abduction. But for the ancient Greek farmer, it was also a highly accurate, mythic almanac explaining the seasonal cycle. When Hades, god of the underworld, abducts Persephone, her mother Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, plunges the world into a barren winter in her despair. The resolution comes when a deal is struck. Persephone must return to the underworld for 1/3 of the year. During these months, Demeter's sorrow causes the earth to become cold and infertile, creating winter. But when Persephone returns to the surface world each year, her mother's joy brings forth the spring blooms and the summer harvest. This myth provided a memorable, narrative explanation for why the seasons change and, most importantly, when to plant and when to reap. The return of Persephone was not just a spiritual event, it was a practical signal that the frost was receding and it was time to prepare the fields. The story transformed an abstract seasonal shift into a relatable human drama, making the essential timing of the agricultural calendar impossible to forget. This practice of turning stories into survival tools is a global phenomenon. The Norse myths, for instance, are filled with descriptions of harsh winters, treacherous seas, and long voyages, serving as both cautionary tales and guides for a seafaring culture. The Native American story of the three sisters, the symbiotic planting of corn, beans, and squash together, is often wrapped in a myth about three loving siblings who support each other and grow stronger when together. This narrative package made the complex agricultural technique of companion planting easy to understand and pass on. By embedding this practical knowledge within a story, it was protected from being lost. A list of instructions can be forgotten. A story about three sisters helping each other survive is remembered for generations. This ingenious method ensured that a culture's most crucial knowledge for food, water, and shelter became as enduring as the myths themselves, woven into the very stories that told them who they were. And this cyclical reinforcement of memory through ceremony found one of its most spectacular expressions along the banks of the Nile. Every year, as the floodwaters began to recede and the life-giving silt was deposited on the fields, the ancient Egyptians would erupt into the Opet festival, a massive state-sponsored celebration that turned the entire city of Thebes into a living theater for their most important creation myth. The centerpiece was a magnificent procession. The statues of the gods Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu were carefully removed from their sacred darkness within the Karnak temple, placed upon enormous ceremonial barks and carried by priests on a journey down the avenue of sphinxes to the temple of Luxor. This was not merely a parade, it was a ritual reenactment of the journey of the sun god, and more specifically, the divine marriage between Ammon and the pharaoh's mortal mother, a union that resulted in the birth of the pharaoh himself as a divine incarnation of the god Horus. For the thousands of citizens lining the route, throwing flowers and chanting prayers, they weren't just watching a religious event, they were witnessing the literal renewal of creation, the re-establishment of mad cosmic order, ensuring the Nile would flood again, the harvest would be plentiful, and the kingdom would remain stable for another year. The annual repetition of this elaborate, multi-day ceremony did two things with stunning efficiency. First, it prevented the myth from fading or distorting over time by performing it on a grand, unforgettable scale year after year, generation after generation. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the collective emotion of the event made the story an indelible part of the cultural consciousness. Second, and perhaps more subtly, it allowed the myth to adapt to current political needs. The ceremony always culminated with the current pharaoh entering the Holy of Holies at Luxor and emerging reborn with his divine power reconfirmed. This provided a powerful, annual reset button for his legitimacy, seamlessly weaving the current ruler into the timeless, divine narrative and strengthening his authority, especially in times of crisis or weak leadership. This was memory hacking perfectly synchronized with the natural world, using the reliable cycle of the seasons to power the eternal cycle of the story, ensuring that the legacy of the gods and the state remained one and the same, renewed as predictably as the sunrise. Beyond the shared emotional experiences and the cycles of ritual, myths served an even more pragmatic and powerful function. They became the very foundation of social order itself. In a world without modern institutions, how does a ruler justify their authority? How are complex laws accepted by a population? The answer lay in a brilliant act of political storytelling, where mythmakers wove narratives that connected the current power structure directly to the divine, making it appear not as a human invention, but as an inevitable, sacred part of the cosmic order. This was the ultimate use of myth as social glue, binding a society together by making its hierarchy feel preordained and unquestionable. It transformed obedience from a choice into a duty, and rebellion from a political act into a sacrilegious sin against the gods themselves. We see this principle operating with breathtaking sophistication in ancient China with the concept of the mandate of heaven, or Chanaming. This was not merely a claim to power, it was a complete cosmological framework for governance. According to this mytho-political doctrine, the right to rule was granted by heaven itself to a just and virtuous dynasty. The emperor was the son of heaven, acting as the crucial intermediary between the celestial realm and the earthly one. His primary duty was to maintain harmony and order, and as long as he did so, his mandate was secure. But the genius of this system was its built-in accountability mechanism. Natural disasters, famines, invasions, or widespread peasant revolts were interpreted as clear signs that the emperor had lost the virtue necessary to hold the mandate. This provided a mythical justification for rebellion and dynastic overthrow. A successful challenger could claim that heaven had withdrawn its favor from the corrupt ruler and had now bestowed it upon him, legitimizing the new regime. This myth created a powerful, self-regulating political cycle that explained the rise and fall of dynasties for thousands of years, framing even violent upheaval as part of a divine, predictable pattern rather than mere chaos. A parallel, though less flexible, doctrine emerged in medieval Europe with the divine right of kings. This political theory held that a monarch derived his authority directly from God, not from the will of the people, the aristocracy, or any other earthly power. To question the king's command was to question God's own will. This idea was often reinforced by coronation ceremonies that were heavily steeped in Christian myth and symbolism, mimicking priestly ordinations. The king was anointed with holy oil, transforming his role into a sacred office. This narrative was an incredibly effective tool for maintaining stability in a feudal society. It discouraged rebellion by making it a theological crime, and encouraged passive acceptance of the social hierarchy as a reflection of a divine plan. The king was on his throne because God had put him there, the nobles were below him because that was the natural order, and the peasants were at the bottom because that was their God-given station. This myth short-circuited challenges to authority by making the power structure feel as eternal and unchangeable as the heavens themselves. This political hacking extended far beyond just justifying who sat on the throne. It was used to legitimize entire legal systems and social codes. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most complete legal frameworks from ancient Babylon, did not present itself as a set of laws written by a man. Inscribed on a towering black stone stele, it begins with an image of King Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, the god of justice. The text proclaims that the gods Anu and Enlil ordained Hammurabi to cause justice to prevail in the land. By framing the law as a divine revelation, Hammurabi made obedience a religious obligation. The laws themselves, with their famous eye for an eye principle, were presented as inherently just because they originated from the gods, not from fallible human judgment. This sacred framing made the legal code more authoritative, more resistant to challenge, and far more effective as a tool for unifying a diverse empire under a single, unquestionable standard of conduct. The myth didn't just tell people who was in charge, it told them how to live, and it made those rules feel as timeless and righteous as the gods who had supposedly decreed them. While the grand rituals and epic poems echoed through sacred spaces, the power of myth was also carried in the hand and held in the home. Ancient cultures perfected the art of embedding their stories into the very objects of daily life, turning ordinary materials into profound memory devices. A simple amulet worn around the neck, a small statue placed in a niche, or the towering presence of a carved totem pole, these were far more than art or decoration. They were tactile anchors for the mind, physical portals that could instantly summon an entire world of meaning, value, and identity with a single glance or touch. This was memory hacking made material, ensuring the stories were not confined to ceremony but were woven into the fabric of everyday existence, ever present and ready to remind. Consider the intricate totem poles crafted by the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. To an outsider, they might appear as a magnificent jumble of animal and spirit figures, stacked one upon the other. But for the clan that raised it, the pole was a vertical autobiography, a heraldic crest carved in cedar. Each symbol, a bear, a raven, a killer whale, represented a chapter in the clan's history, a legendary ancestor, or a supernatural encounter that defined their identity and their rights to certain territories and resources. A young member of the clan would learn their history not from a book, but by having the stories explained in the presence of the pole. The figure of the bear might recall the tale of a long-ago ancestor who learned the ways of healing from the bear people. The raven at the top might symbolize the trickster creator who brought light to the world. The object itself became the textbook, its permanence in the village center a constant, silent recitation of who the people were and where they came from. The totem pole was a mnemonic library, its stories waiting to be unlocked by those who knew how to read its symbolic language. This practice of encoding memory into objects was a global phenomenon. In ancient Egypt, Ushabti figures, small statuettes placed in tombs, were more than mere grave goods. Each was inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, and they were intended to magically come to life and perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife. The act of inscribing the spell onto the figurine's body fused the object with the magical formula, making the clay itself a vessel for the ritual's power. Similarly, a protective amulet carved with the eye of Horus wasn't just a symbol. It was believed to actively channel the god's healing and protective power. The wearer didn't just remember the myth of Horus losing his eye in battle with Set and having it restored by Thoth. They carried its restorative essence with them. The object triggered the story, and the story, in turn, activated the object's perceived power, creating a continuous loop of memory and meaning. Even the humble architecture of a home could serve this purpose. In many cultures, the lintel above a doorway might be carved with a specific symbol to ward off evil spirits, a practice rooted in a story about a protective deity. The family hearth wasn't just for cooking. It was the domain of the household gods, its perpetual flame a small-scale reenactment of a divine, life-giving fire from a creation myth. These objects created a lived-in-memory palace, where every corner and every cherished item held an associative story, reinforcing cultural values and spiritual beliefs with the simple, repeated acts of daily life. The stories became ambient, absorbed through constant, low-level exposure to the objects that embodied them, ensuring the legacy was carried not just in the mind, but in the muscle memory of routine and the comforting familiarity of one's own possessions. This intimate, tangible connection to myth through artifacts made the abstract deeply personal and incredibly resilient, passed down through generations as heirlooms that carried the soul of a culture within their form. Perhaps the most powerful testament to the resilience of these ancient memory systems is how they refused to be contained by geographical or cultural borders. Myths were not static possessions to be guarded jealously. They were dynamic, living entities that traveled along trade routes, migrated with people, and evolved through contact. This process of cross-cultural synthesis was not a corruption of tradition but a sophisticated form of evolutionary hacking. When different mythologies met, they didn't just clash, they often conversed, borrowed, and blended, creating richer, more complex narrative tapestries that could speak to a wider audience while still preserving the core of their original meaning. This ability to adapt and integrate was a key survival strategy, ensuring that a cultural legacy could expand its influence rather than be erased by it. The Roman encounter with Greek culture provides the textbook example of this brilliant synthetic process. As Rome expanded its influence across the Mediterranean, its leaders and intellectuals came into increasing contact with the sophisticated and ancient Greek world. They found a pantheon of gods and a body of myths that were far more developed and philosophically complex than their own relatively simple animistic spirits. Rather than rejecting this foreign influence, the Romans performed a masterful act of cultural translation known as Interpretatio Romana. They didn't simply copy the Greek gods, they mapped them onto their own existing deities, creating powerful synergies. The Greek Zeus, king of the gods, became associated with the Roman Jupiter. Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars, and Aphrodite became Venus. This was far more than a simple name change. The Romans absorbed the rich mythology surrounding these figures, the stories of Zeus's adventures, Hera's jealousy, Aphrodite's origins, and layered it onto their own understanding of these gods' functions. Jupiter retained his primary role as a sky god and protector of the state, but he now carried the narrative weight and personality of Zeus. This integration allowed Rome to adopt the prestige and depth of Greek culture while maintaining a distinct Roman identity. The core Roman values of duty, discipline, and state authority were now championed by gods who also had fascinating, human-like stories of love, war, and intrigue. This synthesis didn't weaken the Roman tradition, it supercharged it, providing a divine narrative framework that could support a vast, multicultural empire. This pattern of mythological borrowing and adaptation is a universal constant, not a historical exception. Centuries earlier, when the Greeks were forming their own cultural identity, they extensively borrowed from the much older civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Greek flood myth, most famously told in the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, bears striking similarities to the much older epic of Gilgamesh and the Mesopotamian Atrahasis myth, suggesting a transmission of this powerful narrative theme across cultures. The journey to the underworld, a central motif in the Odyssey, has parallels in the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Mesopotamian Descent of Inanna. These weren't cases of plagiarism but of creative adaptation. Each culture took a powerful narrative kernel and reworked it to fit its own environment, values, and existing belief systems, enriching its own mythological lexicon in the process. We see this same synthesizing principle at work along the Silk Road, where Buddhism traveled from India across Central Asia and into China. As it moved, it didn't displace local traditions, it engaged with them. In China, Buddhist figures began to take on attributes of Taoist sages and immortals. The bodhisattva of compassion, Guanyin, transformed in China from a male figure into a maternal, goddess-like entity who resonated deeply with pre-existing Chinese values of mercy and family piety. This flexibility allowed Buddhism to put down deep roots in a new cultural soil, creating a unique Sino-Buddhist tradition that was both recognizably Buddhist and distinctly Chinese. The core teachings remained, but the mythological packaging evolved to ensure its relevance and memorability for a new audience. This cross-cultural dialogue demonstrates that the most enduring legacies are those that are open to conversation, that can find universal patterns within specific stories, and that are secure enough in their own core to be enriched by outside influence rather than threatened by it. Yet for all the power of these distributed oral networks, a technological revolution was quietly unfolding that would forever change how humanity stored its stories. The invention of writing was a monumental leap, a shift from the fragile, breathing archive of human memory to the permanent, silent record of clay, papyrus, and parchment. But this transition was not the clean break we might imagine. It wasn't a matter of simply replacing the old with the new. Instead, the earliest scribes and authors performed a fascinating act of technological bridge building. They recognized the profound effectiveness of the ancient memory hacks, and so when they began to write, they didn't abandon the oral patterns, they faithfully transcribed them onto the page. The earliest written texts are, in essence, frozen speech, meticulously preserving the rhythmic, repetitive, and formulaic structures that had made the oral tradition so resilient. This created a remarkable hybrid system, a seamless continuity that allowed societies to embrace the incredible advantages of writing without losing the cognitive power of their age-old mnemonic techniques. We can see this beautiful fusion with stunning clarity in some of the world's oldest and most influential written texts. Take, for example, the poetic books of the Hebrew Bible. The style is saturated with a device called parallelism, a classic feature of oral composition. A line like, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," from Psalm 23 presents a single idea in two slightly different ways. The second clause reinforces, restates, or contrasts with the first. This isn't just beautiful poetry, it's a built-in redundancy system. For a listener, it provides two chances to grasp the meaning and reinforces the central idea. For a reciter reading the text aloud, it provides a familiar, rhythmic cadence that aids fluency and recall. The text was written down, but it was clearly designed to be heard and remembered, carrying the unmistakable DNA of its oral ancestry directly into the written word. This parallel structure is a direct literary echo of the call and response patterns found in oral storytelling across the globe. This conservative approach to a new technology makes perfect sense when we consider the sacred nature of these early texts. For the Brahmin priests of India, the Vedas were not just poems. They were divine sounds, precise vibrations that had to be preserved with absolute, unerring accuracy. The act of finally committing them to writing was likely approached with extreme caution. The primary goal wasn't to create a new literary form. It was to create a failsafe, a backup copy for the true, living repository, the minds of the trained chanters. The written text served as a reference to check against the oral performance, ensuring that the sonic purity of the hymns was maintained. The technology of writing was subordinated to the older, more trusted technology of melodic memory. In a very real way, the written Veda was a guide for producing the correct sound, not a replacement for the sound itself. This hybrid model ensured that the transition to writing strengthened the tradition's accuracy rather than undermining its established and proven methods of preservation. This period of overlap reveals a deep ancient wisdom about the strengths and weaknesses of different media. Orality was incredibly robust, distributed, and emotionally engaging, but it could be vulnerable to cataclysmic events that might wipe out entire communities of rememberers. Writing was more permanent and precise, but it was also fragile. A single fire could destroy a unique library, and it risked creating a passive relationship with knowledge, where information was stored externally rather than lived internally. By creating texts that mimicked speech, early writers captured the best of both worlds. They gained the permanence and precision of the written record while retaining the rhythmic, memorable, and participatory soul of the oral performance. A person reading the Epic of Gilgamesh from a clay tablet would still have heard in their mind's ear the repetitive epithets and the driving rhythm of the line, because the text itself was a script for performance. This wasn't an ending for the old ways, it was their amplification, ensuring that the eternal legacy systems, honed over millennia, would continue to resonate powerfully in a new technological age, their core principles now etched not just in mind but in stone. And so we arrive back in our own time, in a world saturated with information yet often starved of meaning. It might seem that the ancient art of memory hacking is a relic of a distant past, made obsolete by hard drives, cloud storage, and the entire internet at our fingertips. But look closer, and you'll see these very same techniques are being used all around us, not by bards and priests, but by marketers, educators, and leaders who understand that cutting through the noise requires speaking the ancient language of the human mind. The tools have changed, but the cognitive wiring remains the same. We are still the same story-seeking, pattern-recognizing creatures we've always been, and the most effective communicators of today are those who have become modern-day mythmakers, consciously or unconsciously applying these timeless principles. Consider the world of branding and advertising, which is essentially the creation of modern-day myths. A powerful brand doesn't just sell a product, it sells an identity, a set of values, a story we can see ourselves in. Think of the archetypes at play. Apple casts itself as the creator and the outlaw, challenging the status quo and empowering individual creativity. Nike embodies the hero with its iconic "Just Do It" slogan, urging us to overcome our personal struggles and achieve greatness. These companies don't list product features, they wrap their message in compelling narratives and powerful symbolism, creating an emotional connection that makes their brand unforgettable. They use repetition with jingles and slogans that burrow into our brains, and they leverage ritual through annual product launch events that generate awe and anticipation, much like a religious ceremony. They aren't selling smartphones or shoes, they are selling a piece of a modern legend. In the realm of education, these ancient methods are experiencing a renaissance as we move away from rote memorization towards more engaging, effective pedagogies. The best teachers are master storytellers. They don't just present the dates of the French Revolution, they tell the dramatic story of the rise and fall of Robespierre, making students feel the tension and the stakes. They use mnemonics and rhythmic rhymes to help students remember everything from the order of planets to mathematical formulas. They create classroom rituals and immersive experiences, turning a history lesson into a simulated archaeological dig or a science experiment into a thrilling discovery. This isn't just about making learning fun, it's about hacking the memory systems we've evolved with for millennia. By embedding information within a story, attaching it to an emotion, or reinforcing it through a shared experience, educators are ensuring that knowledge sticks, transforming a temporary lesson into a permanent part of a student's mental toolkit. Leadership, too, is fundamentally about legacy building, and the most influential leaders are those who can craft a compelling vision and make it stick. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech is a masterclass in this. He didn't present a policy white paper. He painted a vivid, unforgettable picture of a future America, using the powerful rhythm and repetition of the Black church tradition. He invoked shared myths and symbols, from the promissory note of the Constitution to the evocative image of his children being judged by the content of their character. He made his audience not just hear his words, but see and feel his dream, creating a shared emotional experience that galvanized a movement. This is the power of the spoken word, amplified by ancient techniques, to forge a collective identity and inspire action. Modern leaders in any field, from CEOs to community organizers, succeed when they can articulate a why, a story that gives purpose, creates belonging, and provides a map for the future, just as the ancient genealogies and creation myths did for entire civilizations. This isn't about manipulation, it's about effective communication. In an age of endless distraction, understanding these cognitive shortcuts is a superpower. It allows us to design presentations that people will actually remember, to craft messages that resonate on a deeper level, and to build communities around shared values and stories. The ancient mythmakers were the original experts in user experience design, and their medium was the human consciousness itself. By studying their methods, we learn to honor the way people actually process and retain information. We learn that to make an idea eternal, we must give it a rhythm, wrap it in a symbol, and imbue it with an emotion. We learn that the most enduring legacy is not written on stone or stored on a server, but etched into the hearts and minds of others, passed down not as data, but as a story worth telling again and again. From the rhythmic chants of ancient bards to the viral stories shared across our digital feeds, the fundamental human drive to make meaning last has not changed. We are still the same storytelling species, using the same cognitive wiring, even if our tools have evolved from campfires to smartphones. The early mythmakers, those master engineers of memory, discovered something profound about our minds: that information wrapped in rhythm, sealed with emotion, and shared within a community doesn't just survive, it becomes a part of who we are. They turned spoken words into the bedrock of civilizations, crafting narratives so resilient they could weather millennia, outlasting empires, languages, and even the very stones they were sometimes carved upon. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the most advanced technology we possess isn't made of silicon, but of the stories we tell and the way we choose to tell them. As we stand in our own information-saturated age, where data is abundant but wisdom can feel scarce, these ancient techniques offer us a timeless compass. They teach us that to be heard, to be remembered, and to make a genuine impact, we must speak the native language of the human brain. This means building rhythm and repetition into our communication, whether it's a presentation, a lesson, or a brand message. It means wrapping our core ideas in vivid imagery and powerful symbols that create mental anchors. It means forging emotional connections that transform passive listeners into active participants in a shared narrative. The principles of the oral tradition are just as potent in a boardroom, a classroom, or on a social media platform as they were in an ancient Greek amphitheater. They are the key to cutting through the noise and creating work that truly matters and truly lasts. So the next time you find yourself needing to share an idea, to teach a lesson, or to build a community, remember the eternal legacy systems. Ask yourself not just what you want to say, but how you can make it unforgettable. How can you give it a rhythm? What symbol can capture its essence? What emotion can you engage to make it resonate on a deeper level? By weaving these ancient threads into the fabric of our modern communication, we do more than just honor our past. We unlock a more profound, more human way to connect with each other and shape the future. Thank you for exploring these deep mysteries of memory and myth with me. I'd love to hear which technique resonated most with you in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribing is the best way to ensure